Stephen, tell me about this icon of Ireland's resurrection, Ireland's coming to nationhood. Frank Aiken, we know of him here as a son of Camlock out the road in South Armagh. A fool's guide to him, please.
Okay, well, in many respects, Frank Aiken is quite unique as an Irish revolutionary in the fact that he was born and bred in Armagh County, in Camlock County, Armagh. So the experiences that he would have had as a young man growing up were quite different to many of his contemporaries in Southern Ireland, like Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera. So that, in many respects, was the prism in which Frank Aiken pursued his career, both as a revolutionary and also as an international statesman later in his career at the United Nations. But just to briefly take you through Frank Aiken's career and indeed his events during the turbulent years of the revolutionary period. As you mentioned, Frank Aiken was born in Camlock in County Armagh in 1898, so effectively a man Victorian era. His father was a local builder and also a member of the local county council, so quite middle class upbringing, which is something which is overlooked by many historians. He attended school CBS Newry until the age of 16, but unfortunately his father passed away in 1900. So at the age of 16, Frank was responsible for taking over the running of the farm and also had some involvement in the running of the building business. So at quite an early age, he assumed responsibilities which in many respects built the character that we would come to know Frank Aiken throughout his career.
How did he find the time to propel himself, because he did have to do that, it wasn't a natural hinterland for him, into the revolutionary politics of the Republic to be?
Well, in many respects, he first became engaged in local politics, like many of his contemporaries. So in 1913, he joined the local branch of the Irish Volunteers. Although he didn't take part in the 1916 Rising because, as he said himself, it was too remote. But he did become politicised at this time, and by 1917, when Sinn Féin were running at various by-elections, he actually travelled to Clare for the by-election there, and that's where he first met Eamon de Valera. And it was this relationship that developed over the subsequent years. By 1919, he was commandant of the volunteers in Camlock. So even at a very young age, he was only 21 at this stage, he was commandant of the Camlock Company. And then by 1921, so he was only 23, he actually becomes commandant of the 4th Northern Division.
Yeah, and did we have partition at that moment?
We did, partition, well, the Government of Ireland Act was introduced in 1920, so it was on the statute books legislatively. So yes, partition was enacted by the time he becomes commander of the 4th Northern Division.
So he was in that division, he was there in the north, and his task was to give meaning to, if you like, a new revolution within Northern Ireland and to remove the border and create a united Ireland.
Exactly. Again, he found himself in quite a unique position because at this time you have the effectively the truce of the War of Independence and the negotiations which lead to the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So when diplomacy is coming to the fore in Southern Ireland, you have Frank Aiken finding himself in this new territory of this artificial entity, as he would have said, of Northern Ireland. So while the forces in the south are negotiating for peace, Frank Aiken is looking to Belfast and still leading campaigns against the new state of Northern Ireland. And it's within this context that Aiken's role as a pacifist in many respects comes to the fore, because he also sees that this war against the British is futile and negotiations need to take place.
So he was a Hume rather than an Adams of his day.
Well, if you want to make the connection, in some respects, yes. But his career then is tainted from what happens afterwards. So, and this may be why some depict him as an Adams rather than as a Hume. In 1922, in the aftermath of the signing of the treaty, he joins forces with the anti-treaty. So he opposes the new treaty reluctantly. But during this time, he's allegedly involved in one of the most brutal attacks during this period, known as the Altnavay massacre.
Yes.
Now, there's no evidence to suggest, and I must make this clear, there's no evidence to suggest that Aiken had a leading role, although it was under his responsibility as commander of the 4th Northern Division. And during this time, this is June 1922, 6 Protestant civilians were brutally in Altnavay. So it's within this context that Aiken has, in some respects, blood on his hands, and that stays with him for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of these attacks, he becomes convinced that pacifism is the only policy that can prove successful. So it's he, working with De Valera, that tried to negotiate with the pro-treaty leaders, particularly Richard Mulcahy, who's the leader of the Irish Free State Army, as it becomes known, for a truce.
We're now at this stage, are we, past the Civil War?
This is in the midst of the Civil War.
In the midst of it.
So Aiken is the leader of the 4th Northern Division anti-treaty forces. In 1923, Aiken is actually appointed Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, because Liam Lynch is assassinated and shot in Waterford. So Aiken now becomes the leader of the IRA anti-treaty forces. But even though he's the leader, it is he who ultimately makes the call to lay down arms. And that call comes in April and May of 1923. So he sees the future of armed force. And it's in this respect then you see the demise of Aiken the revolutionary, and then you see the emergence of Aiken the politician.
A journey that would take him to the Elysian fields of the United Nations eventually.
Exactly. So in 1923 he runs as a Sinn Féin candidate in County Louth, and he's successfully elected. And from 1923 until 1969, until 1973, he represents the constituency of Louth for 50 years as a member of Dáil Éireann. And it's throughout this period from the 1930s, with the foundation of Fianna Fáil, he's a minister in consecutive governments. And then into the 1950s, it's really the most celebrated period of Aiken's career. He is Minister for Foreign Affairs, or External Affairs as it was at the time. Particularly from 1957 until 1969, he is Minister for Foreign Affairs consecutively. To this day, he still holds the portfolio of Minister for Foreign Affairs for the longest consecutive period of 17 years. And it's at the UN where Aiken really makes a name for himself, and not just for himself, but for Ireland on the international stage. Because to put it into context, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Ireland was looked upon negatively by the European allies and by America. And it was only by the end of the 1950s, particularly given the fact that Ireland was allowed to enter the United Nations, that Ireland once again was embraced by the world. And Aiken made the decision that Ireland would use this opportunity to fulfil the mission of Fianna Fáil, and that was to declare Ireland's sovereignty and to show ourselves as an independent nation. And in particular, Frank Aiken is remembered for following an independent stance at the United Nations, which infuriated the Americans and the British government.
Sure, they shouldn't have been surprised at that because of the prior history.
Exactly, because of Aiken's, he was a man who had a strong character. He had a sense of integrity, and he was driven by convictions of his beliefs. Unfortunately, many politicians today don't have the same convictions.
Why does he seem to me, maybe this is just kind of the area I grew up in, but why does he seem to me to be fundamentally a man, in spite of his military responsibilities, a reluctant revolutionary of arms, but a man of good heart?
Well, it's a good question, and something I've grappled with myself when trying to when you were writing the book on Frank Aiken. He's a man who has unfortunately faced the realities of his time, and in particular that's the division of Ireland. He sees this as a grave evil, and he can initially the only way of overcoming this evil is through armed insurrection. But eventually he understands the role of diplomacy. And it's something which takes some time to come to terms with. He has to suffer the horrors of war. He possibly murdered people, although there's no direct evidence of that. So this is a man who comes from a revolutionary background, to in many respects to become a pacifist, someone who endorses the peace process, to use a more common term of the 1990s. So in that respect, you can maybe make the connection with Gerry Adams.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Although I don't think Frank Aiken would be too happy with that himself.
He might have been in his earlier days.
Yeah, well, at least, not to go into contemporary politics, but at least Frank Aiken acknowledged that he was a member of the IRA, and Gerry Adams allegedly doesn't.
No, I understand that. I understand that nuance. Yeah, absolutely. So, to what extent did he lose his home territory? To what extent was the man taken out of South Armagh and became something else?
Yeah, well, again, unfortunately, because of the tensions in the north, Aiken moved, particularly when he took up his seat in Parliament, he moved and bought a piece of land in Stanleyford in County Dublin, and he built a house there, and that remained his home for the remainder of his life. That was in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And he had a family there. He married a very influential musician, Maud, who became Maud Aiken. They had several children, and Dublin became his home. He also liked to travel quite extensively, and he spent time, particularly during his time at the United Nations in New York, and also he loved to visit Connemara and improve his Irish.
Was he a cultural man, a sophisticated man, an aristocratic man?
Well, again, this is, if you read the literature, if you read what's written previously on Frank Aiken, he seemed to be in some ways a bit of a buffoon, uneducated, intellectually inept, but that's actually not the case. Frank Aiken was a very inquisitive person. He always said if he hadn't been a politician, he would have been an engineer. And he came up with some ingenious inventions. At his home in Sandyford, for example, he actually used propeller blades from planes as a wind-generating turbine, in advance of what we would know today. He also actually, funny enough, he devised runners similar to Nike runners would have rubber soles. He also devised these kind of initiatives, and this is in the 1940s and 50s. He read widely. He subscribed to Irish historical studies. So again, trying to erode this notion of Aiken in some way anti-intellectual, that's not the case at all. And I think the reason why he was perceived as that way is because of his role during the Second World War. He was Minister for Coordination, and that role was particularly important for censorship. So he censored the papers in Ireland, and the editors of those papers never forgave Aiken for that.
They had the power of the pen. They could paint whatever picture they wanted of him.
Exactly. And in response, Aiken himself was very shy of publicity, and he refused to give interviews in many respects. He rare interviews with Aiken. So the depiction of Aiken, and he never really went out of his way to correct those interpretations. And again, that's why this book is so important, because we've used Frank Aiken's papers, the personal papers available from UCD archives, which previous writers did not have access to. So you get to see the man, the humour of him. He was quite funny. You get to see the relationship with his family. But that's not to say, in many respects, he was quite conservative, and that's something else we try to articulate in the book. He was a product of his time. He feared, for example, modernisation in terms of the media. So he had a reluctance about TV. And there's an example when the Nigerian Civil War broke out in the 1960s.
Biafra.
Yeah, he refused to allow the 7 Days RTE programme to travel there because he felt that they could distort the information. So again, he was, in some respects, he was a moderniser when it came to United Nations policy, but in other respects, he was a conservative.
Back into the violence of Ireland, he would not and could not have been a man to bring the factions of the North together, because he was so tainted with Alt-Neve for a start, and his acknowledged leadership of the IRA. He would have been persona non grata totally at any discussion table, and it maybe gives the wisdom to the later Adams to come, who said, "My hands are clean. I have never been in the IRA." That statement alone perhaps allowed him access to the conference table.
Well, true enough. There's an example of this. In 1938, for the Anglo-Irish negotiations, where Ireland secured the treaty port, which allowed us effectively to be neutral during the Second World War, De Valera would not allow Aiken to travel for those negotiations because he was perceived to be such an anti-British Anglophobe. And if you read actually the British embassy files from the 1930s up to the 1970s, which drafted various character statements on Aiken, he was always seen as being the most vehement anti-British within the Fianna Fáil party, which is a bold statement in itself. But I think that's actually unfair on Frank Aiken. If you look, for example, during the 1950s, it was he, along with Eamon de Valera, who were trying to negotiate cross-border cooperation with Ulster Unionists. But he was tainted, and Unionists despised Aiken, as they did with Eamon de Valera. So he was always stuck between a rock and a hard place. He was trying to move on, but he was also restricted by his own past. And that's why he turned to the United Nations, because this was a new vehicle for him to disseminate his views in the world, rather than the insular nature of Ireland at the time.
So what you're saying takes me along the road to the conclusion that those who were to come, human Adams, were men of their time, men of their day, carpe diem, and no one else could have done it until they arrived.
They're products of their time, but they learn from their experiences, and they realise the futility of armed force, and also the need for dialogue, and particularly the need for communications with your opposition, with the Protestant community. And that's something which Aiken firmly believes himself. But unfortunately, I think he's only his views and restricted the impact he could have possibly made.
So the book is out, and it's in the shops, yes?
It's available in all good bookshops, as they say.
As they say.
Actually, it's been launched next Thursday. By Eamon Gilmore, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs on Taoiseach. It's been launched in Irish, the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin at 6 p.m. So it should be a great event. I know a lot of people from the Aiken family and from Newry and Louth are making their way.
He's a hero here, I tell you. The home I grew up in, my two old aunts who were in the Common Amon, he was God. He was next to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in a sense. That's the popularity of this man.
Absolutely. He's been immortalised, particularly in the North, but he's actually a forgotten figure in contemporary history writing. So that's why this book is quite important, because it just reevaluates and brings to life the man and the politician.
Stephen, you wrote the book, yes?
Myself and my colleague, Dr. Bryce Evans, we edited the collection.
And the challenge in setting out to do it, what was the challenge, really? What was your greatest worry?
Well, I've always wanted to write this book since I first published a work on Fianna Fáil in Northern Ireland, because it was while writing that particular work I realised there had been very little written on Frank Aiken, and I was quite fortunate that the Frank Aiken papers only became available in the last several years. So it's stemming from that initial lack of writing on the subject, that kind of compelled me. And with the hard work of myself and my colleague Dr. Evans, we had to amass several authors who could contribute chapters, which in itself is a very difficult task. But we were quite fortunate because we have fine scholars such as Michael Kennedy, who is the executive editor of Documents of Irish Foreign Policy, and Brian Hanley, who's written about the IRA, and also Noel Dorr, who was the Irish ambassador to Great Britain and who actually knew Aiken personally during his time at the United Nations. So we have a mixture of both Aiken the nationalist, which is Aiken in Ireland, but also Aiken the internationalist, as I said, his role at the United Nations.
Well, when we get the book out, and that's on next Thursday, and in the time thereafter, if you're passing through Newry, our studio is open to you to sit down with me, not on the telephone, but in full view of the camera, and we'll shoot the breeze for an hour or two about the man who was Frank Aiken. God bless you. And as they say in Africa, and where I sometimes go into the bush, Stephen Kelly, go well.
God bless. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All the best.